Good morning, everyone. I am Martha Blackwell, Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the seventh episode of our series, Colombia Continues Searching for the Center, Elections 2026. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you our guests. A very dear friend of CCA, Bruce McMaster, President of the National Business Association of Colombia, ANDI, and our distinguished hosts, Sandra Borda, professor and researcher at the University of Los Andes, and Ken Frankel, president of the Canadian Council for the Americas. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Sandra to begin the conversation. Sandra? Thank you, Martha. Good morning to those that are joining us directly and in video. As you are aware, this is a series that we've been making for several electoral cycles in Colombia, a series that tries to look at different players nationally, not only politicians, but also leaders of civil society and business people like today. What does it mean? What do they understand as center? What type of aspirations they have for the consolidation of the political center? And in each conversation, we've begun to make a balance, an overview so far of the experience of Colombia in their own areas. So let's begin, Bruce. Thank you, first of all, for joining us today. And we'd like to ask you to give us an economic overview of the past 3 years of the Petro administration economically in Colombia. There are huge discussions. There are those that say that all of the outlook of the economic debacle did take place. Others no. What's your impression, Bruce? Thank you, Sandra, Ken, Martha, for your invitation. And it's a true pleasure to be with you to have conversations like this. And I was telling our team, because we have been making a balance or an overview of the year 2025, to find the opinion on it of what's been happening in these 3 years. And what's true is that undoubtedly these are the strangest years when it comes to public policies in our country. And why do I say this? Because we found that from the viewpoint of the general principle that Colombia has protected for many years, today we can say it doesn't exist. And it's that the state abandoned completely the idea of creating trust. So we have to wonder why. And somehow, what are the main tools and instruments used for this? However, I would say, and I would dare to say that the government is in three large stages. One, it begins in 2022 when we saw a government or a president of the republic that was sure that he can do many things and changes. And the changes he had in his mind, perhaps some never confessed or made them explicit, but he wanted to drive that. And I call that first stage the overpowerful government, where he thought that he could do many things. And the big economic event was a tax reform that was quickly approved in 3 or 4 months, a reform that was led by the minister Jose Antonio Campo back then and the president of the Congress, Roy Barrera. That reform had met a lot of opposition in many articles of itself because of the structure. However, the government had enough political force to move on with it, no matter the national discussion over it. So that overpowerful government began with that first stage, and this led to make other reforms. That's called the social reforms, especially talking about pensions, labor, and health. Then we move on to 2023 legislation begins, and in March, the government or the president finds himself that the reforms would not be passed as easily as the first. And the health reform drops or fails. And the government goes to the second phase, in which the president begins with an implosion in the coalition that allowed him to govern the government. So I call it of rage, in which the president sees that the coalition ends, and he also ends discussing or arguing with his people like Alejandro Gaviria, Cecilia Lopez, the National Department of Planning, the Trade Ministry, and Jose Antonio Campo, the Ministry of Treasury. And the government decides back then, even if it's not allowed to go through with its reforms through Congress, he says that he will do it through the executive branch. And for me, it's a period relatively long. I think it's been the longest of rage. And at the end, many things do not happen. The reforms are not accepted. They're declared unconstitutional. The Constitutional Court makes decisions on the three reforms. Right now, it's deciding on the pension reform, but it said other things about health and mentioned things about the tax reform so far. And it changed a lot of from the 2022 reform when it comes to the rates for hydrocarbons. So now we go to the third phase of the government, which is what means I didn't do what I wanted to do. Um, Probably it's because there's a status quo that has been defended, surely, by the leaders that don't want to have the change. And right now, the president says that he wants to do the most he can at the very last minute. And I would call it the third stage of creating eventually a legacy, which is the one that can say, I did something for the country. And this is like the relationship with the government, state and nation, and and economy. When it comes to the economics that you asked me about, it hasn't done badly. It's not, it's really because there's resilience in the economy, like the institutions have shown their capabilities. The same thing happened with the economy. Although there are some indicators that dropped, some others floated above the water. And specifically, we're talking about coffee, also remittances, and surely the revenue from other activities, and the demand in Colombia also grew. And that's why we're doing well. And so that's a summary of 3 years, 3 years and a half. It's not easy, but that's the way I can summarize those 3 years with very different stages. Thank you, Bruce. So, what are the economic challenges, national and international, that stand out that Colombia faces and that the new government will face as well? Yes, Ken, I would say that there are two large universes of challenges. One, those from geopolitics that are big. What's happening in the world is important. What's happening with regards to the position of the US with the trade. The world is bipolar, tripolar, I believe, that India cannot be left outside the equation. Everybody talks about the US and China, but India also is turning into a very major player in this new economy. Of course, the European Union. So, what's happening surely will affect us. And Then I'll refer to that more. And there's another side that has to do with the public policies of the government. For instance, regarding hydrocarbons and energy, beyond the considerations in terms of sustainability and the environment, which surely are important. What's true is that those sectors, those two sectors, have meant a lot for the Colombian economy, and somehow they have been attacked directly by the government, especially with what we've seen with natural gas, Ecopetrol, coal, the activity of mining and copper that has not been developed well, the dependence on hydrocarbons. There's a topic there. It has to do with the local politics. Also, public finances. The government has not been disciplined and has completely abandoned the idea that part of the stability, macroeconomic stability, has to do with having healthy public budgets. And it's not only abandoned it, but I think expressly it has sacrificed trust in public goods because the government considers it's more important to have public expenses to face the economic falls, but also for electoral reasons. And the third big pillar has to do with health. Health in Colombia, like worldwide, it has to do really with public health, public policies. Our societies have estimated that the state should be responsible of serving patients. But if we don't have healthy public finances and something that can help feed the health system, we will have big financial problems and social problems, of course, and we will have it from here on because the deficit is huge. This year, we're talking about 10 billion pesos, $2.5 billion, and we will have one in English and Spanish. The next year, we will have the same thing. Next year, we will have a system that will be feasible, yes, and that's like the third pillar. The fourth pillar is energy. Colombia had an energy policy allowed it since 92, 93 to foresee that it would have a capability enough for the demand. But today we wonder something that we never asked before, and it had to do, does Colombia have the capacity for 20, 20, 27, 28, 29, 30 to operate? Can it grow? There's a question there, an enigma there. And now we see that the president wants to dream big industrially, but his dreams they do not go away well with that. And then the last topic that is not directly economic but has to do with this, there are two things: security, which hits all of our society, of course, the economics, and international relations. Because, of course, Colombia has not a very large exporting capability. Colombia exports, to the US 29% of its exports, like $14 billion to China. It imports also from China and the US. And we're in the middle of a discussion between the US and China, and Colombia feels more empathy with China than with the US. But the big ally of our exports is the US. So sure, we have many reasons to worry and to feel uncertain, and that the next government will have to take over. International relations should be basically something that should be very important for the country. And you can see that you have allies or not. So we have to make decisions, but that should somehow help us to be determined. Thank you, Bruce. Another question. We don't hear a lot in Latin America about the consequences of the growth of India. You mentioned India before, and we will have major ramifications in Colombia and perhaps in Latin America overall. Can you talk about that more? What do you see with the growth of India and its possible involvement in economic issues in Latin America, especially in Colombia? It's very interesting how India has faced international affairs. Let me tell you this anecdote. Recently, South Korea invited me, people from like 10 countries, to visit them and to see the Korean culture and get to see their productive line. And a person from India that I met there was very interesting. We became good friends, and he said, "What do you do?" "I handle the Center of Research of Commercial Intelligence of India." And I said, "What's that?" "Well, in India, in Dubai, and we have a research center, a think tank, where we have 2,000 PhDs in economics, and they're distributed throughout countries. And according to, for instance, in Colombia, we have 30 economic PhDs that are trying to understand what's happening in Colombia. The one for it, and it's not to be spying on Colombia, but to find opportunities in Colombia and how India can make alliances with Colombia that are good, or to make a good trade effort. And this tells us of how they think. They do not intervene. They do not get into the politics of others, of other countries. And it's a country that has the most growth economic during this year and last year, way above that of China. India has been increasing its GDP. It has huge consumption capacity. So undoubtedly, it's a star, a rising star in the world of economics, but also it has a very interesting scientific component because it forms talent. It has brilliant people. So what I believe at is that undoubtedly India is a great power that will play a major role. For instance, Mr. Putin, you saw that he went to visit India last week, not for free, of course. And he'd been trying to have international trade, especially having oil trade with India that he doesn't receive from Europe, for instance. Well, I think that India also has interesting democracy there. It's an authoritarian regime, but it has an interesting democracy history. So I believe that we should pay attention more to India because they're looking at us and they're analyzing the world. They're advancing and they're big. They have research and they have a good marketplace and more capacity to purchase. Bruce, one of the places when you analyze or make a benchmark of economies historically, one of the places that you arrive to is that we've had a very moderate macroeconomic activity in Colombia. And that moderation is invoked a lot today for those that are devoted to making policies. A lot of people say, even Santos, the former president, talks about a value of moderation that we have to go back in politics. Economically, that approximation has a problem, which is petrism, and is that moderation does not give results to redistribute wealth in Colombia. So we haven't been able to face our economic crisis like other Latin American countries, but we are the second country with this with differences. My question is really obvious. Can we have a redistributive economy that is moderate? Can we change our inequality with a moderate economy? Is it part of political policy that is desirable? I think we're talking about two different things, being moderate or not economically, and if it's redistributive or not socially. These are different categories. They don't exclude each other because moderation refers to two or three things. One, to be prudent macroeconomically so the state can work in a scenario that's stable and known in the world and among different agents. It also has to do with trust, to know where we're headed towards the rules of the game and the economic model that we're using, to know what are the medium and long-term goals that's the first discussion. The other conversation is very interesting. I was in charge of the creation of the social prosperity department. I was the director, and we struggled against poverty, extreme poverty. Back then, we had an agency that was eliminated called the ANSPE, which was devoted to work we had with networks to find out the fallacies of each home, and we would measure them in 32 different categories: if they went to school, if they didn't, the home, if they had public utilities, if they could educate themselves. 32 categories, of which 16 were chosen for the multidimensional indicators. So I don't doubt that these categories are very different. Recently, I made an exercise that answered something else, but it led to have interesting conclusions. And it's, what's the effect of informality in Colombia? Colombia has a huge informality rate. 58% of the people at work in Colombia are informal. So we started to look at the figures, not at the figure that everybody knows or that Donnie gives every month, but instead we started to see what are the consequences of that informality. And we made a big exercise to see how informality, what it meant. The total revenue is 1,040,000 pesos of informal people. And we started to look at those that are formal, and they earn 2,530,000 pesos. And let me repeat, 1,040,000, 2,530,000. The 1,040,000 pesos is earned by 13 million people in Colombia. The 2,500,000 is earned by 10 million people. When we made the analysis of the effect of this on the Gini indicator, we saw that's the difference in Colombia. It's not a difference between the poorest and the richest, but the difference between a huge group, 13 million people below the minimum wage, and others that earn more, to the point that if you if you do an exercise, a next synthetic exercise, and you ask, if Colombia wouldn't have those two categories, you could say that the Gini of Colombia would 0.42%, 0.42, which is similar to European countries. With that said, my answer is yes. We have to work on social issues deeply, but you also work with salaries, with variables, keeping in mind the informality. And that's prevalent in terms of the consequences of inequality. But you can also have an economy that's disciplined, predictable, without uncertainty, that works well and leads to have more investors that can create more jobs. So these are compatible, but it's valid only with an economy that's predictable, serious, and attractive, we can overcome the big inequalities that we have in Colombia. The logic that knows, since we've been moderate and somehow we have been reliable in our economy, so that's, and for me, that logic makes no sense. Bruce, thank you for your answer. When it comes to informality, we've heard about that throughout Latin America and other countries, of course, in the world, but especially in Latin America. So my question is simple, but not too simple. How can we decrease informality? It's been a challenge for who knows how long, at least in Colombia to begin. Is there a recipe to drop this, or measures that everybody in which we can all trust? The big problem with informality, Ken, in my opinion, is that it ends up generating very unequal conditions among workers. Because you can say, okay, how important at the end is it to have some with with Social Security, others not? It's important. Those that are not with Social Security, they don't receive pension, they don't have holidays, they don't have the chance of having a working extra hours. I mean, these are workers without rights. And that's a huge problem in our society. To have 13 million workers without rights and 10 million that do. So the question is, has have there been technical groups that have tried to attack this? Yes, some say you have to be you have you have to try to make informality less expensive, but we need a state that has more capability to supervise those that are informal. So the state, however, the state checks and supervises those that are formal, but not the informals, and it's a problem. And you say, well, in Latin America, permanently we see informality, but I think it's a topic that will require to rethink many things. I'd say that if we could imagine a transitional justice for security or violence that have hit Colombia so hard, why can't we find transitional mechanism to migrate from informality to formality? I'd say that we would have to do those things, big things, with major social agreements, seeking that if the owner of a store with two or three employees doesn't feel that being formal is a burden. And because today clearly we see an imbalance in our society. There is no recipe for this, no golden rule. There are countries that have reduced informality in Europe. There are countries that have managed to reduce it. But what's true is that it's a big social problem of Latin America. Bruce, let's shift and talk about international topics. I'd like to ask you to talk about something that we hear constantly. And last week, the Vice Minister of Foreign Relations talked about this. And it's the statement in which this government says, good part of our foreign policy and in the past century has been guided to meet the interests related to businesses. We have understood that our foreign policy is a way to expand and help expand our private sector and to have an economic insertion that's more effective. And that's not bad. That's one of the tasks of foreign policy. But consequently, this government says that that has turned into a policy that represents only one sector of the Colombian society and has let outside others. And they say that's why we have been obsessed with the US so much. We're always thinking about making strategic associations with the US because it's good for business, but maybe it's time to change this. So I wanted to ask you, Bruce, to give us a debate about that argument. And secondly, I'd like to ask you, how do you see that international insertion process ahead? Because I've heard you talk about this, and unlike other arguments I've heard, you don't want it to go back to the past. I don't think it's feasible to lead our foreign policy, but I think we have to see ourselves ahead and to be more imaginative. What's in your head for what should be that international insertion ahead? It's hard to say something interesting internationally to Sandra Borda because she's the head honcho on this topic. But let me try to give an answer, an approximation at least. When it comes to the what he said, the vice minister said, I don't agree. I've always criticized the Colombian diplomatic body because really it has been misrepresented representing the trade interests of Colombia. Colombia's diplomacy has been very poor in terms of trade. And there's like a schizophrenia because I see it that we have embassies, but also we have the pro-Colombias, and the ambassador never feels like the owner of the political policy. So first, I think that Colombia has done poorly with that. Next, I believe, no, we have to think better. What are international relations? Is it between towns, among citizens, among families? But also, it really has to do with, or diplomacy has to do with trying to make the differences of groups that are in a geographic region can have a good relation with groups of other places, including to not have wars in the past. The wars, you may correct me, wars have had two or three main causes. The main cause has been territories when when somebody wants to move the fence of the neighbor to invade an island or take over a bay. That's a big reason for wars, but also religion. The, the, they relive, but really the big wars have been for trade and economic. And there have been wars for economic and trade reasons throughout history. Some are owners of the routes, others some special products, others are owners. And why does this take place? Because, sure, international trade is a way of me getting rich and for me as society to get rich. I can bring wealth from, I sell value added and I bring wealth to my country. But if this is so, it's natural that part of the diplomacy to focus a lot on trade. Why? To serve local needs. The topics to create jobs, to create wealth, value added technology. And today, surely, diplomacy has to do with migrations, those populations that move from one side to another, the representation of Colombians in Europe and the US, families that live there. So I'd say that Colombia hasn't been good at diplomacy. We haven't had ambassadors really devoted to economics. When we see ambassadors in Colombia from other countries, we see how they defend the trade, the value added, the wealth and jobs in their countries through trade. But Colombia hasn't done that. So sure, and today in geopolitics, this is very important. Geopolitics has focused a lot on geoeconomics, everything else that happened in the US, between Canada and the US, between the US and other countries, the discussions with China. It's are more economic related. It has to do with the projections, long-term projections. So I really think that we have to professionalize it more and to make it part of the national strategy. And we've seen weird things. We've seen how in the UN, Colombia gives way commercial trades to be backed in the Security Council for something. And that's strange. It's strange to say I'm going to give the agricultural sector because I'm going to give, or we're giving the opportunity to send us special support in the Security Council. That's strange. And it has to do because the Colombian diplomacy is aware that they represent the wealth or poverty, jobs or unemployment, the capability that we have or not to transfer value added. So I think it's the other way around. We have to be honest about our objectives. Then we have very important causes of mankind, and diplomacy can be a vehicle to move them on, especially related to sustainability with the COPs that we've seen recently, or the causes related to defending rights that mankind has abandoned and retakes, like ethnic or gender, which fortunately allow us to join internationally, creating supranational causes that should relate to human rights and should also be a good task. In this time in which there's so much political decision and with so many proposals that we're hearing, to the many problems that you have diagnosed, which is strange because it's true, we've never had a political process that talks about foreign geopolitics. And something that I heard from Paloma Valencia was to merge the Ministry of Trade with the foreign relations ministries. But nobody talks about institutionalizing communication channels between the foreign trade ministry and the economics or the businesses. So different sectors can be part of making decisions. So overall, what you change institutionally, Bruce, or better, do you agree with what Paloma Valencia proposes? I think that it makes sense, Sandra, especially the Ministry of Trade, because the ministry has trade, industry, and tourism, three different things. And I'd say that Colombia needs a political industry that we haven't had, and we haven't really had it organized. We have big treasures which we exploit more than take care of touristically and without any order. But international trade should go hand in hand with diplomacy, sure. A good example is the diplomacy and what happens in Brazil. They are really the authority of commercial talks, and it makes sense because we don't know the specific weight between one trade and another. So we need people that are specialized, that can talk with the private sector. Let me give you an example. This conversation that was made between Pedro when he went to Beijing about the Silk Route and the new version, I don't remember the name it was given to it, was a conversation without talking with anybody else about the subjects of the agreement. Nobody, like the exporters, the importers, the people of the sector of infrastructure. And sure, it's you have to ask yourselves what criteria is used for these discussions. How are they thinking this out? What is the data kept in mind to make a decision like this? So I do believe that it makes sense because it's part of what's very important for the diplomatic delegations. At the end, there really is no country that has been made rich selling and buying things internally. It doesn't happen because at the end, you have a small, closed group, as closed economy where you start to sell things and they start buying and selling each other. But it's saying that they buy for themselves, it makes no sense. And that's why international trade exists. We need it for technology. So I do believe that Colombia has to think about that, think about it well, to have experts on this. Sometimes, and you surely know this, every time we have a commercial conversation, there's a discussion. Is there is a room next door? Yeah, there's a room next door. What does it mean? That there are technicians sitting next door to give a technical pillar to the conversations, but it doesn't happen. Like the conversation of Petro with China, there was no room next door. So what do they know about the industry, about the products that we can sell or not? And sure, they know nothing because the experts of every sector, of every company are the ones that know. So there we have to professionalize. And that's what Sandra has also asked for in the Colombian diplomacy, because in these 3 years, and even before, we haven't lost a lot of people with professional careers. The chancellors have been very volatile, not unprepared, and that's not good for a country. Bruce, going back to politics, most of the surveys says in Colombia that 45% more or less of the population identifies as being of the center. More or less, it's that. But when it comes to choosing a candidate, the center is like orphaned. What happened? What's happening? Why is this taking place? I think it's super interesting to talk about the center. I mean, what's a center? It's somebody that's between two extremes, and it gives me the impression that no, however, I think that the center, it's a different way of approaching politics, public politics. And it has to do more of not being dogmatic, of being more eclectic, because there are good things that are from a group of people that think one way, from a group of other people that think a different way. And in a country, in a society that's so dynamic, like that of Colombia, but worldwide, we should have the best ideas from all the spaces and use them for everyone. And that's for me the center. For instance, there's an idea that the right is better than the left, but that's not always true. There are groups of the left that are also good. For instance, we saw how Petro asked a colonel and saying, "This is your general, and you have to sit." And he said, I'm your chief commander, and you sit down. You've never seen that before. So, or this is, or when we hear the president say, "You have to do what I say," or that that the law should be met. But no, I think that at least I can imagine, since I had to work on social matters with my background, which was in investing banking, what's the logic? And sure, we have to clearly identify our long term goals. For instance, we want peace. Colombia, we want to reduce poverty. We want to reduce inequality. We want to give people more job opportunities. We want to get into human rights. Colombia wants to focus on minorities. Colombia wants to have a better education. Colombia wants to have better health for all Colombians with good standards. And those goals are of left and right. No, these are goals in which you have to agree. I could sit with extreme left groups and those of right, and it's the same goals. The difference is in one particular point, and is that the state should do everything, or or if the private sector should do things. And there is that we have to be more pragmatic to try to understand how to solve the problems quicker or more transparently and more effectively. So there are some that say, no, this has to have much more participation of the state. And I would say, look, the state isn't very efficient. Others say, no, this should be more made by the private sector. And I'd say, no, forget it, because we can have abuse. So I think that that 45% that you talk about, Ken, are those that are not with the dogmas and really understand that our problems are serious enough to sit down to try to solve them seriously. There's also people understand that the laws are there to be met and that we can't say that violence should take over 500 municipalities of the country and that impunity should give the peace of mind to citizens. But we also have people that see that this has to do with the idea of taking that 32 million people out of poverty. So that 54% of the people that you talk about in the center is much more mature. It's people that that are more dogmatic and think that problems can be solved, keeping in mind what all groups say. I wish we could be eclectic always with the public policies and to keep in mind those that make those public policies. And something else that is that Colombia has been polarized strongly for a long time now, since our old ancient violence times, periods. I can hate you because you are of a different political party. And th- and this is something that we have to solve. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you are busy in the in negotiations and you asked us to be shorter so you can leave and carry out a task that's far from easy from any viewpoint. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. To all of you, thank you for joining us. And we hope to continue this conversation because this part about the political center today had additional developments and will continue to do so. So thank you. And let's give the floor to Martha. Okay, thank you, Sandra, Bruce, and Ken for this great conversation. Thank you for joining us all today. We invite you to follow us on social media to receive news about upcoming episodes in this series, as well as other events related to the center in Colombia. And we want you to share with you our new report at ccacanada.com. Remember, videos in Spanish, English, and French will be available at our website. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all. No, thank you all. Martha, Sandra, Ken, thank you.